The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's customer exclusive webinar, Genesys API, Parameters, Relationships, and Diagram Export. My name is Donna Long, and I will be your host during today's webinar, presented by Andy Dodson. We're excited to explore the Genesys API. Andy Dodson has been with the Genesys development team since release 2.0 and has authored, updated, or scratched his head over code in most parts of the architecture. He's a big fan of the Genesys API and its ability to integrate applications across the enterprise, which offers the potential to leverage and fine-tune system investments to best meet organizational needs and goals. He's performed a variety of systems development and project management roles for 18 years, mainly within the Microsoft .NET framework and SQL Server environments. Before Andy gets started, I have a few housekeeping items. We will be answering questions today at the end of the presentation. Please send your questions in as soon as you think of them through the question tab on the webinar control panel. Andy will answer as many questions as he can today, but if we do not get to your question, we will reach out to you after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded. If you experience connection problems during the live presentation, you will be able to access the recording in the My Support area of the Vitech website. If you have any questions regarding the recording, please contact us by emailing support@vitechcorp.com. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Andy. Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks for joining us. Again, my name is Andy Dodson, and today we will indeed be talking about the Genesys API, and more specifically, we're going to be getting into programmatic access to parameters, relationships, and relationship attributes, and diagram exports. So hopefully this stuff will come in handy for some of your development efforts against the Genesys API. Okay, now as we start stepping through the API, we are going to be primarily focused on code. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of software as we get going with running through our API here. Excuse me. If you're interested in more overviews of the API, more higher level descriptions, you may want to check out our first webinar, which is on the API, which is more of an introduction to it, and it does provide some of those higher level overviews and descriptions, which you may find helpful. It does get into some of the more prerequisite items as well, such as logging in or licensing, and some of the other basic items you need to kind of get started with an API. So I thought I'd just mention that. That's another resource that's out there for you if you're interested more of in overview of the API. So today we'll definitely be stepping through some code here. So we're going to be looking at some software, though we will kick it off with a brief review of parameters and relationship attributes in Genesys. So let's go ahead and take a look. We'll go ahead and bring up the main Genesys client here. And as you see, you have a pretty basic project loaded here called Genesys API Webinars, and we are going to be focused on components today. Let's go ahead and load one of those up. Let's take a look at component A here. And I'm going to go ahead and switch over from our default attributes tab over to our parameters tab down here. Let's take a look at those parameters. And as we see, our good old component A here has been assigned 3 parameters. Availability, which I can't pronounce very well, so I'll be working on that today. So we have availability, decision threshold, and density. So those are our 3 attributes that have been assigned to our component A here. And just as a quick review, you're probably familiar with this, but to assign parameters to entities, we use our add remove button up here. So if I go ahead and click that, it brings up our parameters dialog, and we simply select a parameter of interest, move over here to our add button, and it's going to go ahead and assign that parameter to the entity. So that's how we get parameters assigned to entities. But again, for our component A here, we have a couple parameters already assigned. And the second thing to look at here is that regardless of a parameter's type or regardless of its definition, all parameters are going to have 5 values. Okay, they're going to have an objective, they're going to have a threshold value, they're going to have a design, they're going to have an observed, and they're going to have units. Okay, so again, regardless of a parameter's type or regardless of its definition, they're always going to have these 5 values available to them. Okay, so that's kind of a quick run through of parameters. Next, if we move down here to the bottom and we take a look at our relationship browser, let's take a look at some relationships for our component A here. And as we see, we have 3 built from relationships to our component. We have a built from component A1, from component A2, and from component A3. And if we go ahead and expand our relationships over here, we do see the relationship attributes that are part of the built from relation definition. Okay, so all built from relationships are going to have our 3 relationship attributes currently. That's going to be part multiplicity, part role, and whole multiplicity. And today we're going to be focused on part multiplicity. And what we see here for our first relationship, our first built from relationship, we've assigned our part multiplicity to 1. For our second relationship, we set it to 2. And shockingly enough, for our third relationship, we set it to 3. Now to edit any relationship attribute, we simply double click that attribute. It's going to bring up a dialog for us, and we can simply enter whatever value we like, set OK, and that will go ahead and make that assignment to the relationship attribute. Okay, so that's a quick run through of our relationship attributes. Okay, so let's go ahead and switch over to Visual Studio, and we'll take a look at an API application that's been put together here. And actually, if you did see our first webinar, this is an extension of that one. So it's the same code base, okay? So this is gonna be a simple WPS app, and we're gonna go ahead and start this sucker up. So let's get it running. And as we see here, the first dialog that we're gonna run into is gonna be our login diagram, or login dialog. Now, we went through this in our first webinar, and what we're gonna do here is simply click OK. And that's going to trigger the login process to the Genesis service that we're targeting. In this case, I'm hitting my local Genesis service. And it also went ahead and logged us into a project, which is going to be that pretty basic Genesis API webinars project that we were just looking at. Okay, now I'm going to hop down here to webinar 2, and let's go ahead and click our show button to get that started. And so what we have here is our main form for webinar 2. And the first thing we're going to look at are those parameters. How do we access those parameters and those 5 values that are part of each parameter? So we're going to go ahead and look at the code for our display button here. So back to Visual Studio, and here we go. Here's our display parameters click event handler. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And as we see here, I've gone ahead and encapsulated this code in a second method down here, because we are going to reuse this as we update parameters in order to call it and display the results in our API application GUI. Okay, so let's go ahead and shift down to our get and display parameters method here, and let's take a look at that. Okay, so to start stepping through it, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab a sort block. Okay, because in just a second here, we're going to get a list of entities. And we're going to want typically, we're going to want to sort a list of entities by some criteria. Sort blocks are a great option for that. And we can fetch sort blocks. It's kind of going back to the first webinar, you may remember it. But we can fetch a sort block via heading to our project instance and then calling get sort block. In this case, I'm grabbing the numeric sort block. So we're ready to go with a sort. Next thing we're going to do, in order to grab some entities now, first thing we want to do is we want to fetch a folder out of the project. And as you see here, once again, maybe a little bit deja vu from our first webinar, we can grab a folder via a very simple call to get folder against the project, and we simply pass in the folder of interest. So in this case, I'm working with a new keyboard here, and I may fat finger it a little bit. Go over, and I did it again. But we're going to adapt, improvise, and overcome here. So we're going to call, again, project get folder. That's going to give us that component folder. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to leverage that folder, as we see on the far right with our second highlighted line. We're simply going to call folder get entities, and that's going to return us all entities in that folder. In this case, it's going to be all components in our root component folder. Okay. Then we are going to hop on down here to standard loop. Okay, standard for each loop, for each entity in our sort block sort entities against our entity list, which is essentially going to give us a for each entity in our sorted entity list. And then we'll go ahead and enter our loop here and begin operating against each entity in our list. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call a real handy method we saw in our first webinar to fetch an entity attribute. Okay, in this case, I'm going to get the name. I'm going to get the name of the entity. So we're going to leverage our good old entity get attribute value string. Now, the beautiful thing about get attribute value string is that it's type agnostic. Okay, so regardless of the attribute we're fetching, which may be of any types, booleans, datetimes, rich text, the nice thing about our call to get attribute value string here is it's going to do that string conversion for us regardless of the attribute's type. Okay, so that's going to give us that entity name. So the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to go down and we are going to start looking at how we fetch those 5 parameter values. So to begin working with those values individually, we have one utility method we can leverage here, and that's not going to be a shocker. How it operates, instead of entity get attribute value string, we're going to call entity get parameter value string, pass in the parameter name of interest. Once again, get parameter value string is going to kindly do any type conversions against our parameter and convert that to a string for us, so we don't got to worry about that. So that's a nice little utility method against parameters. Now this one does kind of beg a question, because if we remember, parameters have 5 values. Okay, it has an objective value, a threshold, a design, an observed, and a units value. Okay, so it begs the question a little bit of entity get parameter value string, which of those values is it going to return? But what this one actually does is it fetches the objective portion of the parameter, and it also fetches the units portion of the parameter and concatenates them together for us and returns it as a string. So there's going to be cases where, you know, instead of fetching those independently, put them together ourselves, get parameter value string is going to give us that objective and units concatenated together, and we'll actually see that demonstrated when we launch our API app GUI, and we'll see how this renders. Okay, so moving into fetching each of our parameter values individually. The first thing we're going to do is we want to get that raw parameter object. Okay, instead of heading into get parameter value string, we want to go ahead and get the raw parameter object. And we do that via a call, as we see on the far right here, called entity get parameter. Operates basically the same. We simply give it the name of the parameter of interest, and that's going to return us that raw parameter object here. So we got the raw parameter for availability. Now, once we begin working with the raw parameter object, the first thing we want to do is we want to check that thing for null, because we have to remember that not all parameters are assigned to all entities. Okay, so the parameter we're looking for here may not be assigned to an entity. Okay, and if so, it's going to be null. So we always want to do a null check here when we first fetch a parameter prior to beginning any operations against it. Okay, at this point, we know we have a good parameter, not null, and we can go ahead and move forward with fetching our 5 values. Now, as we see here on the far right, to fetch our 5 values, we simply call parameter.objective, parameter.threshold, parameter.design, shockingly, parameter.observed, and lastly, parameter.units. So we leverage that raw parameter object to fetch each of those 5 values against it. Now we also see some other null checks in here, for instance, objective. The first thing we're doing here is we're going to check that objective for a null value. And the reason that is if any of our values here against the parameter haven't been set yet. So if a user hasn't entered a value for it yet, that's going to be null. Okay, our object, as you see here, that's an object type. I'm sorry, our objective is an object type. Same thing holds true for our threshold. That's an object type. Design is an object. Observed is an object. So if it hasn't been set yet, that value is going to be null. It's going to be a null object. So if it is, in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and use string empty. If it's not null, I'm going to go ahead and grab that objective, do a single conversion, get decimal points right, and then go ahead and convert that to a string. Okay? And we see that same pattern repeated for our values here. We're simply going to fetch each objective, the threshold, the design, the observed, check each for null. If it's null, hey, we're gonna make that a string empty to represent the value. If it's not null, go ahead and set that value and do the type conversions needed. Now the last one we see down here is units. Now we don't need a null check on units because units is not an object type. Units is a string. Okay, so if a user hasn't assigned a units value yet, that's okay. Don't need to do a null check. We're just going to get back an empty string in that case. The unit's a little bit easier. No null checks required there. Okay. Now the rest of our code here is simply setting up some local data structures in my API application so we can hang on to them for display in our API GUI. So no Genesis API specific here, specific stuff here. Okay. So let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to go ahead and pull up our main Genesis client in the background, API application in the foreground, and we are going to click our display button in order to fetch those parameters and fetch those values per parameter. So you're going to go ahead and click this display button in 3, 2, 1, go. And so here we go. We have a little grid in our API app, and as you've seen, we've gotten all of our components in our root component folder, fetch that availability parameter, and we see each of our 5 values reflected in our grid here. Our objective, our threshold, our design, our observed, and our units. And here's that call to get parameter value string. And as you see, it's concatenated together with the objective value for us and the units. So that may be a handy utility from time to time if that's the value you're looking for. Okay, so that is access to parameters and parameter values. Okay, so our next step down here, how do we update those parameter values? Let's go ahead and head over and check out the event handler for our update click event. We are going to head back into Visual Studio. And we are going to minimize our get and display parameters method and move up to update parameter click, our event handler for our button. I'm going to go ahead and show that. And as you see, we don't have a lot of code here. Pretty tight. Let's go ahead and step through it. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to need an entity to operate against. And to fetch an entity, we're going to leverage that project method called getEntity. So project getEntity, in this case, we want an entity by name. We know we're looking for component A. So we're going to call getEntity against the project, passing in component A. And that's going to give us that entity instance that we can begin operating against. Okay? So once we have an entity, let's start looking at updating those parameters against the entity. So the first thing we want to do here, as we just saw in our previous method, is we want to fetch that raw parameter object so we can get at its values. So we make the same call we just saw a minute ago, entity get parameter, giving it the name of the parameter of interest. That's going to give us that raw parameter object, and we can begin working with it. First thing we want to do again is we want to check that parameter for null, because once again, this parameter may not be assigned to this entity. So we want to do a null check there against the raw parameter object. Well, once we're sure it's not null, I don't think this is going to come as a big shock. We simply take that parameter, call objective, set it to a value, threshold, set it to a value, design, set it to a value, observe, set it to a value. We're also going to update that units value. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the last thing we want to do here is, just like in any case, if we update the data for an entity, the last thing we want to do is call the update method against the entity. That's going to trigger the push up to the Genesis service that we're connected to, and from there on into the database for persistence. So the last thing we're going to do is call entity update to push our values up ultimately into the database for persistence. Okay. Finally, the last little bit here is once again calling our get and display parameters method in order to access those parameters, launch them in the grid so we can see the results. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that. We'll check out updating parameters. Now, once again, I'm going to pull up the Genesis client in the background, API application in the foreground, and we're about to do an update of our availability parameter here. Now, in this case, you may want to keep your eye up here on the main Genesis client because we are about to programmatically update those values, and we should see the Genesis client respond to those updates and get dynamically updated. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and click our update button for that, update those parameter values in 3, 2, 1, go. And so there we go. So in the background, we see that our availability parameter has responded with the updates in our main Genesis client to reflect those programmatic updates to the parameter values. And of course, our API app grid here has also been updated to reflect our new objective, threshold, design, observed, and units value. And here we once again see our get parameter value string call at work, which is going to go out there again and grab that objective value, grab that units value, and concatenate them together. Can come in handy as a useful utility from time to time. Okay, so that is updating parameter values. Okay, let's go ahead and move on down to relationships and relationship attributes. How do we get to these relationships in Genesis, and then how per relationship, how do we access those relationship attributes? Let's go ahead and take a look at that. And we are going to look at our event handler for our display button. Click here. Okay, so back over to Visual Studio. We're going to go ahead and hide our update parameter click event handler and move down to our get relationships click handler. Let's take a look at that and we will start stepping through it. Okay, so ultimately here what we're after is getting some relationships for an entity. Once we have the relationships, we can leverage those relationship instances to get the relationship attributes associated with each relationship. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we're of course going to need an entity to operate against. Going to make the same call we just saw when we were updating parameters. We're going to grab an entity via project get entity, giving the method the entity we want to retrieve, in this case by name. The project get entity is going to give us an entity instance. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to leverage that handy get attribute value string against the entities to fetch some key attributes for display. In this case, we're going to grab that numbered name and description. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we are going to grab some relationships from this entity. And there I go again, fat fingering my new keyboard, but we'll keep adapt, improvising, and overcoming. So what we're going to do to grab a list of relationships for the entity, as we see on the far right there, we're going to take our entity, have a pretty intuitive call to a method called get relationships. Once again, we are going to pass in the item of interest. In this case, we're passing in the relation name of interest, and this is going to return us a list of all those built from relationships for the entity. Now, yes, this is an IEnumerable of type I relationship. I use the term list simply for brevity's sake. A little bit easier to say than IEnumerable of type I relationship. Okay. So we've grabbed a list of all those built from relationships. Next thing we're going to do here is we are going to sort that relationship list by some criteria. Now I'm going to come back to this because it's going to make a little more sense in just a second here. Okay. So next thing we're going to do, we're going to enter a standard loop through our relationship list for each relationship in the list. We're now within the loop operating against each relationship. And the first thing we're going to do here is call a funky method against relationship called traverse. Now this is another really handy method. Now what traverse does is it returns you the entity on the other side of the relationship from this entity, with this entity being the entity we give it. Now, our entity instance in this case is component A. Okay, so if we call relationship.traverse against component A, it's going to return us the entity on the other side of the relation for it. Another way to put it is that's going to return us the target entity of component A in this case. Okay, so that's how we traverse an entity. Traverse a relationship from one side to the other to get the entity on the other side of the relationship. Okay, pretty handy method there. Now let's move back up to our sort of our relationship list, and this will probably make a little more sense here. Now all we're going to do here is use a little basic link against our list, and the criteria we're going to pass into that in order to sort it is we are going to give it a call here to say, hey, for each relationship in that list, traverse it using this entity or component A. So traverse it against this entity to return me all entities on the other side of the relationship. It's going to give us those entities, sort this list by their names. Okay, so in essence, what we're doing with this sort here is we are sorting our relationship list by the names of all targets of component A for the relationship. That gives us a sort of that relationship list by the targets, essentially. Okay, so back into our loop through all relationships. We've now grabbed that target entity. We can use that for display. The next thing we're going to do here is we are going to grab that part multiplicity relationship attribute. Okay, and we're going to do that via a method that's not going to come as a big shock to you, and it's called get attribute value string. Okay, we see this against entity or against the identity type. It's also present against relationships or against an I relationship instance. So relationship, get attribute value string, give it the relationship attribute of interest. And once again, the method's type agnostic. So get attribute value string is going to return us that relationship attribute as a string regardless of its types. All attributes in Genesis, as well as parameters, are of different types. They may be floats, ints, booleans, date times, rich text. That's why we like to leverage this get attribute value string method. Take care of the string conversion regardless of those types. Okay, so we now have that part multiplicity relationship attribute for this relationship, and we're ready to go. And that's really it. The rest of our code down here is more saving off the data that we're collecting into some local data structures simply for display in our API application GUI. So this stuff below here has nothing to do with the Genesis API specifically. We're just saving it off so we can display it in our API app GUI. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let's run this code. Once again, I'm going to pull up the main Genesis client in the background. We see our relationships for component A, and we're after this part multiplicity. Set the 1 here, set the 2 for our second relationship, set the 3 for our third relationship. So back to our API GUI in the foreground, and we are going to go ahead and click our display button here, which is going to run that code we just stepped through. Let's go ahead and do that in 3, 2, 1, go. And there we go. So our API application grid here has gone ahead and fetched that component, number, name, and description. It's then gone out through that get relationships call against built from, retrieved each of those relationships. We've used traverse to get the entity on the other side of the relationship from component A. And we've also fetched that part multiplicity using relationship get attribute value string. Okay, so there we go. That is access to relationship attributes, starting with how we fetch relationships, iterate through them, and grab those relationship attributes as well as the target entities involved with each relationship. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and let's take a look at how we can export Genesis diagrams as images. Now, personally, I love this stuff. I love the calls involved here. It comes in really handy. And if you're familiar with Genesis, you actually see our exported diagrams And what you're seeing is leveraging the code, the exact code you're about to see. So the stuff that you're about to see is the technique we use to export images. Export diagrams as images into things like our reports. So a report showed diagrams at times that leverage a call to export a diagram as an image. TeamView, if you're familiar with that, where we export a model as HTML files. Each entity in TeamView, you can view its diagrams. We leverage this exact same stuff you're about to see in order to get those diagrams as images, load them into or call them from the HTML pages in TeamView, or PowerPoint, if you're familiar with our PowerPoint connector, which is all about selecting a list of entities and a list of diagrams and getting those diagrams into a series of PowerPoint slides. Once again, exact same technique that you're about to see. So we leverage a lot within Genesys, and it's really handy to get those diagrams out as images so they're available for use in any other application. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look at our export button. Click event here. So I'm going to move back to Visual Studio. And we are going to minimize our Get Relationships Click event handler here. And we're going to take a look at Get Diagram Images Click. Now I have split this up into two different methods, simply for readability, not for reuse. The code can get a little bit longish here, so I've split this up into two methods, merely for readability. So let's start with our click handler for our button. And we'll start stepping through it here. Now, the first thing you're going to see is you're going to see a reference to Diagram Exporter. Diagram Exporter is a type in Genesys. And the first thing you may want to notice here is we're not creating a new instance of it yet. We're simply getting that reference to it and leaving it null. That'll become more apparent while we do that in just a minute here. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we are going to create a very basic list of type entity diagram type. Okay, that's another Genesys type. Now, entity diagram type is actually an enumeration. We're going to head over here and look at IntelliSense for it. So we have an entity diagram type reference to an enumeration here. I'm going to go ahead and look at IntelliSense. And as we see, all diagram types in Genesys are present in the enumeration. Okay. So entity diagram type is an enumeration with all diagram types in Genesys. Okay. So essentially what we're doing here is we are creating a very simple list of type entity diagram type. And what we're going to do with that list is we're going to go ahead and we're going to initialize it with two diagram types, two entity diagram types. In this case, I'm going to leverage the hierarchy diagram and the spider diagram. So I have a list ready to go here with those two diagram types. Okay, the next thing we're going to want to do is obviously we're going to need some entities to operate against to export diagrams for them. Going to call some code you may be aware with by now. First thing we are going to do is we are going to grab a folder, in this case the component folder. We are then going to leverage that folder in our second highlighted line there to call get entities. That's going to give us a list of all entities in that component folder. Next thing we're going to do, a little bit of deja vu, we're going to fetch a sort block because we're going to want to sort that list of components. Once again, we're grabbing the numeric sort block. And then we are going to step into a standard loop of all entities in our sorted entity list. So for each entity in sort block, sort our entity list. Okay? And that moves us into an operation against each entity in our list. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to call our second method here called export diagrams. And we are going to give that method the current entity we're on. We're going to give it our diagram exporter workhorse class. Once again, that's our primary workhorse type in Genesys for doing diagram exports. So we're going to pass that in, and we are going to pass in our diagram type list. Okay, so let's go ahead and bounce down to our export diagrams method, which is down here. And let's take a look at that. And we're going to go ahead and step through it. Okay, so remembering that our method here received the current entity we're on the diagram exporter workhorse class for doing the export, and our entire list of diagram types. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to enter a standard loop through those diagram types for each diagram type in our diagram type list. So we're operating on each diagram type now. Now, the first thing we're going to see here are two very handy utility methods. Okay, we leverage these all the time in the internal Genesis code. Can probably come in pretty handy for you. And the first one is going to be a static method. Open entity diagram action can execute. Give it the entity we're on. Give it the diagram type we're on or interested in. And what this does is it validates that the diagram type is a valid diagram for the entity we're on. Because we have to remember that not all diagram types are valid for all classes. For instance, components have a subset of diagrams that are valid for them. Functions have a subset of diagrams that are valid for them. So our can execute method here, open entity diagram action can execute, it's going to check that entity. More so, it's going to check its class and determine if the diagram type of interest is valid for it. And if it's not, it's going to return false. Say, hey, this diagram type's no good for this entity. And what I'm going to do in this case is I'm simply going to bail out and move on to the next diagram type. Okay? So that's our first pretty handy utility method for diagram exports, and that would be open diagram action can execute. Ensure this diagram type is good for this entity. So our second utility method here involves empty diagrams. Okay, sometimes when we're doing diagram exports, we're not interested in diagrams that are empty. Of course, an entity may be constructed in such a way, based on its relationships and whatnot, where particular diagrams are simply empty. There's no content to render for that diagram. And that's what this method is going to check for. Once again, it's a static method, has content. Simply give it the entity of interest and the diagram type of interest. If it's empty, that's going to return false. In which case, in this case here, I'm simply going to bail out once again, move on to the next diagram type in the list. Okay? So sometimes we do want to see empty diagrams, sometimes we don't, but that's a very nice utility method to determine if a diagram is in fact empty for an entity. So you may want to keep these two utility methods in your back pocket. Okay, so we're good to go at this point. We know that we have a diagram that's valid for the entity we're on. We know we have a diagram that has some content for the entity we're on. And now we start running into that diagram exporter. Now, if you remember, all we did initially was set a reference to that without creating a new instance of it. And the reason we do that is the diagram exporter can be a little bit weighty, okay? And typically, we're also running through a series of loops to export, multiple diagrams as images. So what we want to do here is we only want to create a new instance of that when we first hit it, and then we want to reuse that same instance. So if it's null, we haven't hit it yet, we need to go ahead and new it up. We need to create a new instance. So we're going to create a new instance of diagram exporter. We're going to pass in the current entity we're on and the diagram type that we're on here. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set the overall background color of all images that are exported using the exporter. We're going to set that background color to white. Okay, on subsequent passes here, as we're heading through our loop, our diagram exporter and instance has already been created. We want to go ahead and hold on to that, reuse that same diagram exporter so we get a little bit of performance boost since that type is a little weighty. So after we've already used it once, we got a good instance, and all we need to do here is update the entity that the diagram exporter is operating against to our next entity of interest, and same thing with our diagram type. We simply update that existing diagram exporter instance to our entity and diagram type of interest. So we're ready to go with the diagram exporter now. Next thing I'm going to do here is since we are exporting diagrams as images, we're going to have to save them on our local file system. Okay, so all I'm doing here is creating a file path and name for our image that's going to be exported. Okay, next thing we're going to do to get into the actual export, first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a standard .NET IO memory stream. Okay, then we're going to hop into our diagram exporter. We're going to call export, and we're going to give it that memory stream. And essentially, the diagram exporter is then going to grab that diagram, convert it to an image represented by a memory stream. So it's going to populate the contents of that stream that we give the export method. Okay, next thing we're going to do down here is we are going to use a standard .NET IO file stream to take that memory stream that has its contents now populated with the image we're after of the exported diagram. So we're going to leverage a standard IO file stream, take that memory stream, and write it to an actual file on our disk. Okay, so that's all we need to do here. Rest of the stuff here is once again saving off our data as we've collected it into some local data structures for use, so we can simply display this stuff in our API app GUI. Okay, let's go ahead and do this. Let's go ahead and run this code and do some diagram exports. Now in this case, I'm going to pull up my Windows Explorer in the background, and as you see, I'm just on a temp directory. And this is the one I've assigned to place our image export files into. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up our API application in the foreground. And let's go ahead and click our export button. So when we do this, that export is going to run. We may want to keep our eye up here on the background on our folder, because we should see those images get created and added to the file system in that folder. Okay. So you're going to go ahead and click our export button in 3, 2, 1, go. And there we go. So that diagram exporter chugged along, and we see those image files getting created. In our API app grid, we've got each of our components with a simple file link down to the images. So we can go and click, for instance, our spider diagram for component A. Let's go ahead and click that, go. And that's simply a link down to our component A spider diagram. And close that. Maybe we want to check out that hierarchy diagram, just a file link down to that image saved to the drive. Okay, so pretty handy stuff. We can get some images for each of those diagrams. Bam, they're now available for any application that you'd like to use them in. Okay, well, that is really it in terms of running through each of our items here. Lastly, as always, we want to do a log out of our Genesis service and project, free up all that memory information and hooks into the Genesis service. Let's click log out. We stepped through that in our first webinar, and we've now made a clean exit out of our Genesis service. Okay, so that's really it here. That's how we programmatically access parameters, programmatically update them. That's how we go in there, grab a list of any kind of a relationship against an entity and access those relationship attributes as needed. So hopefully that is helpful, kind of add to your bag of tricks. And the Genesis API, I really enjoy using it. The more we learn with it, of course, it is pretty intuitive. Of course, it takes a little bit of warm up, but the more from there we get with it, the more we have the ability to create a whole variety of solutions and applications across the enterprise to really flexibly meet those needs that come up. So you got a lot of power available to you there, and once you get into it, it's pretty fun too. Okay, so if any questions have come up, I'm more than happy to take a crack at them. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to our hostess of the mostest, and that's Donna, to see if any questions have come in, and we'll try to address them. So back to you, Donna.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, we've already received some great questions thanks to our participants. I encourage you to join the discussion right now and to submit your questions using the webinar control panel. Okay, our first question is from Ron. He would like to know, as a first-time coder in Genesis, how does he know what methods are available? And is there some kind of listing somewhere?
Yes, there is. There is a very thorough, dense help file that's part of Genesis for all the API method calls that are out there. Every one of them are out there. That's in the Genesis help link. I believe it's the top right of the Genesis client. And if you click that, you'll see an API reference, and you can navigate through every type in Genesis, every public type in Genesis, and look at the various methods that are available to you. Now, we also have a batch of documentation installed with Genesis. You can see that, I believe, through the Start menu. If you head to your Genesis item in your Start menu and look around in there, you should see, I believe, a link to our documentation. And we do have some API getting started guides, which gives you some overviews to some of those entry-level items just to get you started, which is kind of Pareto rule, 80% of the work, getting started, getting logged in and connected to repositories and whatnot. And at that point, you can certainly leverage our two API webinars to pick up some methods, or you could, once again, you could head into that help link, which I believe, I'm not looking at right now, but in the main Genesis client, I think it's far right, a little blue question mark. Click that and start browsing around and see if that gives you what you need. And if it doesn't, please feel free to fire us a note, and we'll try to help you out as much as we can.
Okay, great. A question from Bob. Is there any way to determine if a parameter has been assigned to an entity other than fetching the parameter and checking for null?
No, there's not right now. That's the only way to check it. We make a call against an entity to get parameter, and the only way to check to determine if that entity has been assigned to the, if that parameter has been assigned to the entity, is to then follow up with a null check against the parameter that we attempted to fetch from the entity, the get parameter call.
Okay, so a question from Doug. There were no parameters passed to the entity update procedure. How did the update routine know that you wanted to update parameters?
There were no parameters passed to. Can you read that again?
Yeah, there were no parameters passed to the entity update procedure. How did the update routine know that you wanted to update the parameters? I guess when you did the entity update?
Okay, well, there's a couple different parts for it. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to stop I believe y'all are looking at my question slide. I'm going to exit out of that, and let's hop back into Visual Studio. Let's take a look at that. And I believe we were talking about this method right here. Okay. So the elements involved with this, the first thing we need to do is fetch an entity. We're going to need an entity to operate it against. Okay. So we have an entity. The next thing we did here was against the entity on the far right, we called get parameter in order to get a particular parameter of interest. So that's how we went from entity to a parameter of the entity. After ensuring that the parameter is not null, we then moved into simply updating our 5 different values for the parameter. After we did that, we called the entity update method to push it up to the database, essentially. So hopefully that answered your question, and if not, shoot us a note and we'll give you some more detail.
Okay. Question from Jeff. What are the image formats that can be used when exporting a diagram?
The image format. I'm forgetting those off the top of my head, but I will find them shortly. Let's see here. Yeah, bear with me. I had this in the back of my mind, and I've forgotten it. It's definitely going to be bitmap, going to be GIF,
Ping.
PNG.
Mm-hmm.
It should be in here, and I am missing it somehow. Nothing I can go with. Iron Smooth, Unity, Function Definition, Export. Why is that not giving it to me? Okay, I had that, and it has escaped me. But I can shoot you an email. If Donna has your contact information, we'll let you know. But there's actually an enumeration out there associated with the diagram exporter, which you can set the export type that you'd like to use with the diagram exporter. It's going to be all the standard ones. Typically, we use PNG, which got JPEG and GIF. I think TIFF is one of them, and there are two more, I believe. But I can certainly find those and send them to you.
Yeah, BMP, GIF, JPG, PNG, TIFF, and XPS.
That may be it. That sounds right.
Okay. Okay, so if not, we will definitely get back to him. Then the final question, unless anybody else sends one in, is where can we get this code that you're demonstrating?
Donna, you may be able to answer that better than me. We will certainly package all this up, the code. Now, what we've done is if you're a part of the first webinar, we've gone ahead and expanded that same application. So our .NET API app has demonstrations for both webinars in it. So we can certainly send you that, and we can send you the project, the Genesis project we're working with as an export, and you can simply import that, and you should be off to the races. Now, just as an FYI, this project is using the latest service pack, which is about to be released, which is Genesis 5 SP4. If we're using prior versions, we may have to tweak it a little bit in terms of the assemblies that you're referencing, license assemblies and this kind of thing. But we can certainly package all this up and make it publicly available, either send it directly to you or some other technique that Donna may be more aware of than me. But there's definitely no IP in here, and we can certainly get it to you.
Okay. Yes, just send a message to support@viteccorp.com, and we will be glad to send it to you. We will have it up on our customers under our My Support site. We just don't have that set up just yet. Okay, thanks, Andy. That wraps up all the Q&A we have today. If you have any other questions or comments for Andy, please don't hesitate to shoot him an email. He'll bring up his contact information here in a minute. And you can send a message to support@viteccorp.com, and we can get it over to him. Thank you all for joining us. Please keep an eye on your inbox for more webinar invitations over the next few weeks. We also keep our online calendars updated with our upcoming webinars. And at the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please do take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. That's all for today. Once again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.